Thank you to BQE, the makers of BQE Core, for their support of this episode. BQE Core is the software that makes it easy to manage your projects and people for maximum productivity and ultimate profitability. Learn more at bqe.com. I mean, we've both designed schools, yeah? I've definitely been in those meetings, those user group meetings where they bring in a security expert and they start drawing prison lines on the plans because that's what schools need to be in order to keep bad people out. That's how I would characterize it. And it's like a surgeon. Their job is to cut. So the answer is surgery. And for sometimes it's like a retired police officer or whatever, and they come in and their job is to make it look like a prison because that's what keeps violent people out and it keeps the safe on the inside. And it's never that easy, right? I mean, and just to think about where I've practiced versus where you've practiced and thinking about the way schools are designed in different climates and areas, and every community has a different set of inputs that are going to help flesh out what that school is going to be like to be in. There's so many things, so many factors, and it's so easy to come back later and say, well, it should have been this way when something happens. And you can never foresee what those things are going to be in the future. Of course, you're trying your best to plan for any number of things that could possibly happen in the future on a school campus. It's impossible, right? It's an impossible task. And so you do everything you can when you can to make it a safe, but more important, a learning environment that's conducive to that, right? And those things don't always align. They just don't always align. So I think about what happened, and I think about how there's a lot of armchair quarterbacking going on, and there's experts being interviewed on, every school should have a armed police walking around. Every school should have a single entry gate, which, all that kind of stuff just screams prison to me. That's what it screams.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Think about the student experience, which is something that we often think about when we are designing schools, is the student experience on a day-to-day basis and how that all psychologically plays into the student experience in the name of safety. I get it, but at the same time, like it is creating potentially oppressive experience, right? And all that stuff does weigh on the psyche of the students who are attending a school.
You've been on numerous school board meetings. You've been in, numerous design meetings with school capital construction committees and things like that. You've been on meetings with PTAs. You've been on all of these different meetings who help shape the future of schools. And I know that you have probably dealt with the school of the 21st century, and what does that mean? And yes, part of the conversation when we're talking about the school of the 21st century is the conversation of school safety and how to increase the school safety. But none of them ever really mesh. They never really match. Ideals of one thing don't match up with the ideals of something else. And I've been in meetings where every time we have a school shooting, and now seeing how it's happening more and more frequently, security is first and foremost. And so I'm just thinking about, and it's hard to put into words, all of the emotions that I've got going on right now. A lot of them is anger. A lot of them is disgust. A lot of them is a lot of things. But, if I'm putting it specifically in the context of architecture and just thinking about the evolution of all of these the different policies that shape schools, I've seen where in Florida, when I first started my career, and in Florida, there was the open campus. And, very much where you entered into basically a shotgun building that was connected several different buildings that made up a campus that were connected by breezeways.
We call it a
So
finger plan. We call it don't call it a shotgun building.
yeah,
Jesus.
that's well, I
Unfortunate.
I mean it's just it's this long singular building.
Right. Double loaded corridor right down the middle.
Well, so
Oh, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about a single row of
okay,
classrooms with an
sing
outdoor, like
exactly
covered walkway
yes,
that connects them
yeah.
all together. Right.
So
This is
not
very Southern California as well, by the way.
and so and if you think about like that, then you think about the evolution of that as we started to take different security and safety measures into mind. And it isn't just necessarily about active shooter, it's talking about predatory actions at school, and there's all these other different concerns that it started to morph. And I don't know if your Southern California footprint of a building changed as much as Florida's did, where it went from something that it was you changed classes outdoors. You left you left out of that room, you went outside, you walked down the corridor to your next classroom, or you walked across campus to another one. They're all indoors. It is a fully connected.
Yeah, no, that never happened here, really. Climate won't allow. I should say funding doesn't allow buildings to be fully enclosed here in Southern California because yeah, they're not going to pay for it. And I think this is something I definitely want to get to. I don't want to derail you, but I think we should talk about the dollar aspect and what architects are up against when designing schools. Because again, if we kind of go back and look at this from the armchair perspective later on, this is definitely one of those things where it's like, well, yeah, if cost was no object, we would do all these things. So anyway, back to your school design changes over time in Florida.
Even those similar issues that you're talking about on climate and everything else. I mean, Central and South Florida certainly deal with very similar issues as that. But so we have even though we have the same similar climate concerns, the security outweighed everything. We saw buildings that were trying to capture a lot of like natural light, where then you changed it where there was people not there was a committee that basically said your windows have to be 6 to 8 feet off the ground.
Right. Can't see inside in the classroom from the outside. Right. It's distracting to the students on the inside. It's a security reason for the outside. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's not even I mean, there's countless studies that show that natural daylighting in classroom actually contributes to the learning environment. We all know this, but when architects speak up and say, hey, these security measures are making this a prison-like atmosphere and stuff like that, there's like the variety of different people come out of the woodworks telling everybody why, this is, oh, but you can do this and you can do this and you can do this. And it's, sort of like telling us how to do our job.
There's a lot of fighting. There's a lot of things fighting for they're just trying to be the top topic. And the fact of the matter is none of them can be the top topic when you're doing this. And then something horrific like a mass shooting happens and there is only one topic, right? And of course it's after the fact, but that's just, it's so difficult to design a school with all of these competing factors.
Right. Exactly. But then, you have situations like this that happen, but then you have all the armchair quarterbacking, like you said, it's just like, you've got to do this and you got to do that. And then they say, well, but what do you think, architect? Tell us how to do this. How do we implement this? How do we design this? How do we do this? And, but they never really listen to some of the implementations that we have when we try to make a hardened, safe, but also aesthetically pleasing, something that works with the studies of teaching community on what makes a good classroom and all of these other things. And so the AIA came out with their statement of reflection.
This is a time of reflection. That's the name of the statement, right?
Which, is just a very knee-jerk, we've got to make a statement, and here's our statement.
We have to make an empty statement.
That's
Oh,
yeah. I'm glad you said it because
we
I was going to
must.
say we have to make a statement. It's going to be a empty statement, but just so everybody knows that we're here and we're here to help you, but we're going to make an empty, kind of statement. We're just it's just sit down and talk with your tens of thousands of architects who do this on a regular basis that actually can sit down and help craft a real statement.
There's so many things wrong with this empty statement, and I will just put a link to it in the show notes for those who haven't seen it, because I'm sure even if you did, it kind of doesn't even matter, right? It's just one of those statements where it's like, here we are, we're AIAing, and I don't mean that. I guess I mean that how I said it, but it's like there's nothing of substance to it. There's nothing of like it mentions the that we are the crafters of the built environment, and that's not a quote. But it's like the built environment matters. Like we need a much stronger stance from a national organization about the built environment and how it's conducive to this or takes all of these other things into consideration. And that this statement is not it. And because really, I think what we find ourselves in the position of being in as architects of schools and modernizations and retrofits and add-ons and all, there's many different ways that architects touch schools. And guess what? Architects have to touch schools because they are, these are public buildings. These are commercial buildings. They have to be done by an architect. And there's so many different things that we have to deal with. And usually they're just in reaction to policy. And that could be good policy and that could be bad policy. And I think what I want to see from the AIA is working at a policy level of, in this case, gun violence, right? There needs it's not like guns are just one output of the what I see personally, and I don't necessarily want to go this direction in the conversation, but we have a society that is obsessed with violence. Obsessed. Like seriously, try to watch a PG-13 movie without crazy violence in it, and it practically doesn't exist. And that might even go for PG. And not even to mention video games and the total obsession with violence that this country has. And we wonder why things like this happen. It's pretty obvious to me. And I say gun violence because this is the thing in the headline right now that became the output of this tragedy. It became the tool of output for this tragedy because of gun policy in this country. And so then architects are left to pick up the pieces of reacting to bad policy to design environments that then need to deal with acting with bad policy. And to me, this is where the AIA needs to have a very strong opinion and position on how to deal with these things so that the people who do design the built environment don't have to deal with this crap. And therefore, everybody after the fact, armchair quarterbacking this, pointing the fingers at the designers of the place who, like, I guess this is where we start to get into funding.
You're talking about some good points here, and I just want to comment on a couple of just these like knee-jerk reactions that you're talking about when you see these comments in from like everybody. It's just like, okay, let's take this specific one, and obviously there's a variety of different ones, but this specific one where they're just like, well, the shooter entered through an unsecured door.
I keep seeing this crap about the door. This is not about doors.
Exactly, and that's the thing is just like, but the reactions are, these knee-jerk reactions are, oh well, what is the door even doing there? Why would you have a door there when you just have this one door? Why not just that one front door? And you're just like, this is where
architects have failed. The AIA has failed in substantiating the value of what we do, and I don't mean it that way from like a marketing speak, but I mean from like a life safety point of view.
Exactly. And so the conversation really is like, hey,
it is so complicated. It's so hard.
Well, it's complicated, but I've gotten so frustrated because there's so many different of these, knee-jerk reactions to it's not the gun, it's the person, it's not the person, it's the building, it's not the this, it's the that. And I'm just like, oh
It's
my
the door.
Lord, you know,
It's the
and it's
door.
the
It's the
door,
door that was
you know.
propped open. That
And
shouldn't
it's
have
just
been.
like, well, you know, when they were coming back in, you know, the door didn't lock. We're going to investigate, you know, why it didn't lock. And it's just like we're losing focus on so many different things. But where specifically architects and the AIA could focus in on is talking about all of the proactive measures that we as an organization have taken throughout all of these conversations about how we can be a part of the conversation when we're talking about school safety, because that's what we do. There's been so many times where I'm sure you have, and I know I have, sat through so many different seminars of security experts and things like that. I'm doing it on my current project right now. We're talking about, you know, they've got security guidelines for the overall development and also the campus that we're working on and how those, you know, interact together. And then because it's a campus and there's 8 buildings, you know, how is that security implemented within each of these buildings? Because you aren't going to have just one front door for a campus. So how do you, you know, control security throughout all of that? And so there's all of these different conversations that we as architects are a part of, that have as much expertise in being able to design and develop we can call it a hardened building, we can call it a secure building, we can call it whatever we want to call it. But we've got so much expertise or understanding of how to be able to take and implement a lot of these security ideas, or at least be a part of the conversation of the security ideas. Because I know that me personally, I come into this thought of security and safety, especially dealing with gun violence, from almost a military aspect. And it's just, and I think about like, okay, in all of my training as a soldier and now as an architect, how would I prevent somebody who was trained like me, or at least are thinking about, you know, doing harm to someone? How do I prevent them from doing it through design? Just this level of frustration that I have, because when I read the hollow statement from the AIA, I just, like, you know, who are they talking to before they make these statements? Who are they, you know, are they talking to the architect community at large? Are they talking to architects who have security backgrounds? You know, I'm sure that there are plenty of people out there that are security experts as architects who are part of this conversation. And are they talking to them? Because if we're just being another knee-jerk reaction to this overall, you know, problem, then we're not really solving anything.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think even just opening up the conversation instead of saying here are the answers, and I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form that there were any answers in that hollow statement. This is what we need to be having conversations about as a profession, and those experts can then opt into that conversation and be a huge part of it and add value to that conversation. And instead, it's like, as you may know, I think the very last thing is like, as you may know, I'm looking for it right here. As you may know, AIA was integral to the enactment of a law that created the School Safety Clearinghouse, a multi-federal agency of effort to address school safety through a variety of efforts: architectural, mental health professionals, law enforcement, resources, etc., including design. And so basically this whole thing, its call to action at the end is go read this website. And it's like, to me, it's not, the answer is not, well, we've already created this resource that is probably on many levels a dead document. I don't know how often it gets updated. I mean, if I click on the link, I believe that it takes you to a site that it does look like it gets updated every once in a while. But like thinking about it, like there's definitely nothing on here regarding the latest incidents. And I just think like this is not a conversation. And the other thing that I don't like about this statement is that it does not encourage any conversation either. And even the Twitter, if you look at the Twitter post for this, and I get it, it's hard to run an organization. It's hard to have like a really it's not, I don't know if it's hard, but they don't have a very strong position on this because it's not like this hasn't happened before. So I'm not quite sure why, but it doesn't, like, here's our statement, and it's a time to reflect over this. And it's like, let's take a few minutes. It's like, oh, this is just news that this news cycle is going to go away. There's going to be another tragedy soon that will take our attention off of this. I don't think that's the answer at all. Like, this needs to be something that engages this audience that they have of members, of like 94,000 members, to do something about this for school safety at a national level. And there are going to be a lot of insights gleaned from that for schools that already exist to be able to implement, coming from architects who are members of the AIA, coming together to help solve this problem. Obviously, we're a piece of that puzzle. We are not the solution to this problem. But it needs to be, the call to action is not go read this one website. That, like, it needs to be active conversations. It needs to be something that engages people where they are right now, today, 2022, June, not this other stuff. Let's take a quick break to share more about our sponsors. Systems and standard operating procedures. You already know that's how to build a profitable business and find the freedom you want. You need systems and procedures. But you struggle with choosing the systems you need most and how to implement those systems quickly so you can get back to doing what you love most. The Designing Your Business Masterclass series was created by an acclaimed architect and business consultant, Douglas Teager, FAIA, to help fellow architects and engineers run their firms more profitably while maintaining a healthy work-life balance. Douglas grew from a solo practitioner to become managing partner of his 30-plus person firm, and then later sold his firm so he can do what he does today, helping architects be more successful at Teager Consulting. On the third Wednesday of every month, Douglas dives deep into an essential topic that will strengthen the profitability of your firm and make it sustainable for growth in the years to come. Register now for the Designing Your Business Masterclass with Douglas Teager at bqe.com/masterclass and start implementing powerful systems for the profitability you need and the freedom you want. Every live masterclass session includes AIA continuing education credit, and when you visit bqe.com/masterclass, you'll have access to the full library of past sessions on demand. The Designing Your Business Masterclass is free, and it's brought to you by our friends at BQE, the makers of BQE Core, the software that makes it easy to manage your projects and people for maximum productivity and ultimate profitability. Register now for the next Designing Your Business Masterclass at bqe.com/masterclass. That's bqe.com/masterclass. And now let's get back to our conversation.
So I went to the website and I went to the targeted violence section of that website. And then you scroll through the featured resources. And, it doesn't look like it's been updated. And if you actually go and you look at the featured resources, 2018, 2017, 2017.
And that might be good information, but it does feel stale. And it might turn somebody off immediately to say, like, there's no recent research here.
So okay. It's hard for me to talk about this for the simple fact that I have a wife who is a first grade teacher who I'm looking at one of these right now, a K through 12 active shooter exercise starter kit.
Let's all practice for our deaths, people.
And I think about, in anger and frustration, the fact that my first grade teacher, who not only has all of the challenges of underfunded, overcrowded schools and things like that, and everything else, that amongst all of that, she has to sit down with 6-year-olds and talk about active shooters and what those drills are. And what was amazing about some of the stories that I heard coming out of this tragedy was the fact that there were little kids who had their cell phones and who were calling 911 because now, yes, they were calling them because they went through all of these active shooter drills and things like that. And so they were prepared, and so you can say that, all of this training, but I just think to myself, how have we become the society where it's okay I mean, because you've now created a starter kit for 6-year-olds to avoid being shot at school. What the hell?
This is why I started the conversation off with us being addicted to violence. And it's not like we're addicted to violence so that this kind of thing can happen, right? But it's this kind of boiling of the frog over decades of things getting more and more finely tuned to basically enable teenage boys' dopamine levels to be constantly firing. And it's like, this is just now the way that it is. And parents who are slightly disconnected, I'm sure it's even parents who are not disconnected at all, just have, there's like, this kind of thing is going on everywhere on all kinds of levels, and it's quote unquote normalized. And therefore, all of our facilities that are for the public, like these, now have to react to that. That's the world that we live in, and therefore this is how we have to design them, because, and it's not treating the cause, it's treating the symptoms. And I can't even imagine what your wife has to go through to do that. And then imagine it actually happens, and like these kids have been practicing for it. And that's the society that we live in.
Well, so not only does she have to spend, time during the summer preparing curriculum for the upcoming year and things like that, but many times she is going in and spending a 2-week training period on self-defense, on how to disarm an active shooter. It's just
crazy making.
It's crazy making.
I want to get back to this funding idea just because I want to tease it out a little bit. I don't practice residential architecture. I don't know what the current kind of cost per square foot, just to give us kind of a data point on this of, I have a sense that custom single family homes are somewhere in the $700 to $1,200 per square foot range. I could be off, but do you have any sense of where that is?
I think you're off on the way high side, but those
are the fancy houses.
Those are the fancy houses. Those are the really, really fancy houses.
So what if some people who are just building a nice but not spec house?
Let's just say a better than normal builder home is probably in many of our residential friends will probably
they'll send
completely,
us the email. Yeah,
they will send us the email.
We didn't ask this question ahead of time.
No, is probably like in the 250 range, and could be, and then as you're starting to get into more custom homes and things like that, I would say that when I was practicing and doing residential, and this is now close to 15 years.
This information doesn't matter anymore, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah. Well, probably. Well, I mean, I was doing like high-end residential 15 years ago, and it was $500 a square foot.
Yeah, so that is way higher now. That's the numbers I was quoting.
So, yeah.
Anyway, the only reason I bring that up as a data point is because like houses, small houses are expensive to build. Schools are also expensive to build, but what is the dollar per square foot, if you had to pick a number, average that is allocated for a school building?
Well, I know that a lot of times it starts with a 1.
Yeah, right. It's probably, and I don't know current numbers. I would imagine those have also gone up because of the industry right now with supply chain, and I know wood especially is ridiculous. It went from like $100 a board foot to $1,200 a board foot. So it's something insane right now. And in California, we build a lot of schools out of wood. So I would also just echo your, 185 to 250 was kind of a normal elementary school price range. And so, the only reason I bring this up is because, like, why aren't there 2 doors in every classroom? That's why. Like, there are decisions that have to be made. I mean, there's also other things like building code. There's also other things like security, putting a lock on every door that's facing the outside. There's also other things like, well, I'm trying to think of what all the different things could be, but teachers having, a perspective on the classroom, being able to control access. You introduce another access point, and that just creates havoc in a lot of ways. And you multiply that times however many classrooms there are, and it gets crazy fast. So you think about all that kind of stuff, and it's like there's always the question, since this is about doors, right? Why aren't there more than one per classroom? And it's like, well, there's actually a lot of reasons why there, and usually it comes down to money.
And it's funny that you say that, because there's been many a times where I'll start a project off, and especially back when I was doing, like K through 12 all the time, and, many projects per year, that I would start the project off, obviously sitting down with the teachers, first going through the ed spec, the educational specification of that particular jurisdiction, about what they want, what they require for theirs. Go through all of the...
Which is often dictated by other schools that already exist in the district, right? And not about the school of the future.
Exactly. No, it is such a baseline, and it is not... and then going through the standards of, the school of the 21st century, and then trying to like overlap them with those, then going through all of the standards of the state funding policies, and, what is going to be required as a bare minimum for state funding at whichever level is chosen for all of that. And so you go through all of that, and all of that doesn't even remotely take into account the actual, like, sitting down with the teachers and really going through and talking about, like, the conversation of, like, how you teach, and what make, like, okay, you're working in a building that is designed to... it was probably that value engineered building that, they took all of the extra doors out because, money in windows and things like that, and all of that other stuff. And then you're like, well, what would improve this? And then you start to implement all of those things. But then, exactly as you said, you start to chip away at all of those things as you start getting closer and closer to that dollar figure. It's like, oh, you designed it to the high end. Well, we need to start getting it to that low end.
Right. Yep.
They start off at the high end and like, oh.
Yep. And then we start talking about all the compromises that have to be met. And I guess my real point here is the amount of investment in public schools is crazy low for our society. And to think about like all the what ifs and what could be's, and if we could do it again and all of those things, like the reality is there's no funding for many, many, many districts out there. There are some, of course, that are the exception to the rule. Like I can think of many here in Southern California, but there are others that are the other end of that spectrum, where people don't vote for those bond measures because their kids are out of school. And what is it? Why do they want more of my tax money? There's all the excuses in the world.
Like, I want my tax money to go here instead of there.
Yeah. Yeah. And like everybody does get to decide that. Those are individual decisions that get to be made. But when it comes down to designing schools or to modernizing schools, that happens very rarely. Like every 30 years, that school might get modernized for technology updates, for various small things, HVAC upgrades. Maybe they're going to add a multi-purpose room, but they're not going to go back and retrofit every single classroom with whatever. They're just not. And so this is the kind of investment that our nation, the people of our nation are willing to put into schools. And so that's just another constraint that architects are working within, and it is easy to say later, like, well, how come there weren't twice as many doors in a school than there are, right? Because then they at least had a chance, right, to get out. Then like it just, that these are the real world things that architects have to deal with. And it's not even that the architect gets to decide, like those decisions are made by lots and lots of people.
Oh, and massive committee. It's so at the height of doing all these K through 12 schools that I was doing, my local school where my kids went to school, they were adding a security vestibule where, so when you come in the front door, the original school, when I was taking my kids to school, you come into the front door and you're pretty much right in the front hallway. And so they were going to add a security vestibule so that you go into that front door and you're you're basically corralled into the office, and you can't check in until, and they buzz you in, at the front before you actually get into the office. They'll buzz you in, and then you go through the whole protocol of, like, logging in and all this other stuff. You go and take your ID, and you get scanned and everything else before you can even go into the building. And that part is fine, except for what their solution was, is that they essentially created they, instead of modifying it to a point where they would probably have sat down with an architect or a security expert or something. They said, well, we need a security vestibule, and so here is the front door. Here's how we need, here's the easiest way for us to, like, add one. And they did that. And what they ended up doing was creating essentially a bottleneck where it's a single wide corridor, and we're only talking about maybe 5 feet wide.
Mm-hmm.
Think about a school, an elementary school, that has
Everyone has to pass through that.
over 1,000 students passing through that door,
Right.
and the logistical nightmare and everything else that is created. And so,
because they're not stepping back and looking at it with the right
exactly
people at the table at the right time.
They're like, okay, we have this problem. How do we solve this problem? But how do we solve this problem not only, the right way, the most efficient way, something that helps the functionality of the school itself, but also, they created, in my own personal opinion, in fact, my own personal experience, because I had a kid who, they were all trying to go out the door, and everybody was trying to jam through the door, and he got, kind of pushed into, it was really heavy gauged. This new security vestibule was this really heavy gauged stainless steel, or not stainless steel, steel curtain wall. I'm blanking.
Tube steel, yeah.
Tube steel. Anyway, and he got bumped into it, and he got, he hit his face, and he came home with a black eye just from going out a door. Now, think about, like, a fire or things like that, or any of these other things, and try to, how many people would get exactly. And these are the things that we
have to weigh. Yep. This is what we work on. These are the problems that we solve. Yep.
We talk about, I'm going to just say it. There's really honestly no other way to say it. We have to think about things like these oblique corners, and it was dubbed in one school district as the rape corners.
Yeah. Yep.
And
I've heard that too.
And all of these different things that we have to deal with, to look at, and all this other stuff. And we think about these things. We think about, okay, if there is a blind corner, how do we prevent that? Or how do we help, that, so that, you get more eyes in that corner, so it's not a blank corner anymore. You can actually see within it, and all of these different things. And there were so many different conversations that I've had sitting there in front of the Capitol construction, both the actual, like, planners, big air quotes there, and the security people and the maintenance people and all of these other things, to talk about all of these things and really try to have them see what it is that we're trying to do to implement those. But it's having that conversation with all of the right people in the room. And when you don't have the right people in the room, you get these things where, a kid just tried to leave the school, gets a black eye.
I have a similar story without any bad outcomes, but it was determined at some point during construction of a K-8 that I designed that the front door needed to be protected by bollards in case a car was going to just be smashed through the front of a building, because I guess that could happen. Sure, I'm sure it has happened. Right. Anyway, the solution that came out of the construction trailer, which, again, this was just kind of a last minute ad during construction. Hey, somebody, shows up and says, hey, what are we doing about people who try to crash their cars through the front door? And the solution that came out of this, I was not a part of this conversation, which is mind blowing to me, that I'm not even invited to participate in this conversation. And it's always framed as like, hey, we drew this thing up, but we wanted to get your input. What do you think? After the fact, right? And I kid you not, like, the number of bollards that surrounded this front piece of glass in the main administration, like, check-in area, like you're describing.
Yep.
It was like a jail of bollards. Okay. Like, and so again, like, there are many pieces of a school that are prison-like. Doesn't mean they have to look or feel prison-like at all. because that's what we design around. We design around the constraints, the necessary constraints of security, safety, all of these things. But it doesn't mean it has to look and feel like that, because again, that does have a psychological impact on every single person that passes through those front doors. And over time, that does not set up people to be great contributors to society, great civilians, right? It's like everybody's living in fear at this school. And part of that is because it looks like a prison. And so it's like, no, we don't have to accept this solution. Seriously, they sent me this PDF. I can't even tell you. There was probably 18 bollards that kind of formed this frame around the front door that kind of projected outward toward the parking lot. And it's like, if you're telling somebody something, that's to me what it said was like, hey, like we're proactively responding to you trying to drive your car through the front of this. It's not going to happen because look, we just put 18 bollards here. And instead, it's like, no, we're not doing that, right? We're not going to make a prison of bollards in front of the school. And so it was not, it seriously took like 20 minutes. No, I'm just going to design these different radius concrete pedestals and kind of randomly place them so that the distance between them never exceeds X footage, right? So that somebody can drive through it, but it gives the place a feel that is not a prison. It gives kids something to sit on. It makes it more playful because it's a school, and it's not going to give anybody the psychological impact of the prison vertical bollard look. And it was like when I sent that back, I'm like, no, we're going to do this. And it's like, whoa. And in that moment right there, it was such a great example of why architects need to be at the table when these decisions are being made.
I went through this exercise on one of the last project. I went through this exercise on numerous K through 12s. Kindergarten, the last kindergarten that I did, not kindergarten, the K through 5 that I did, same thing. They, for security reasons, because of whatever active shooting event that happened at that particular time, now they want to have this and that and stuff. And so, I mean, I'm totally for every discussion around school security, but I want to be a part. I want us. No, I don't want to sound selfish. I want us as architects, as design professionals who understand exactly what you just said, that we can implement all of these. But let's have this conversation early on. Let's not, again, knee-jerk reaction where now we're going to have this 5,000 bollards right in front of it. So you're basically, having to kind of like, zigzag through to get into the front door because then they're not thinking about, again, these potential safety hazards of, okay, yeah, you're in, and yeah, you can't you can't have somebody enter in with a vehicle or something like that, because you have this thing. But now think about the other ramifications of exactly the psyche of what you've created with that, this like, and now you've created this, prison-like, situation. And, so many times I've heard in the past 2 weeks, oh, well, suck it up. If it, wants to look like a prison, it should look like a prison just so they know that this is secure.
We are talking about the future leaders of this country.
Yeah.
And we are talking about how they're educated and the environment that is so that they can be effective leaders of this country. And there's a huge spectrum there, right? But that's like best case scenario. We can't create the type of learning environment that creates those kind of people with the lack of a stance against a policy position like this. We can't. As an industry, as a profession, if we can't stand up and say the source of this problem needs to change, then we don't deserve to do this job. We don't. Like, we can't just stand around entitled and saying, well, we've got to do schools, like, because we're the ones who have to stamp the drawings and we're the ones who do our like we don't just get to do it by default if we can't stand up and say we have to go after the source of the problems, not the symptoms of the problems. Just it's not going to work. And to me, kind of gets back to an earlier episode about the SciArc stuff, right? And the lack of response from our community that, as far as I can tell, nobody wrote in to tell me where I could go look, and I've looked. Like, there's very little conversation going on about the toxic breeding grounds of this profession. And this is a very similar subject to me, where if we can't be bold and say, here's why this matters and here's what needs to happen to solve it. We have a very large lobbying agency working on our behalf. But if we're quiet, then they're going to make hollow statements. And that, to me, is just completely unacceptable. And we don't deserve to exist as a profession. And so they will find ways around us, they being the people who want to build these things. Like, there's no question in the future. They will find, if we're not adding value, if we're not actually helping solve these problems, then we're not necessary, right? And right now we're just necessary because somebody wrote it into a law. But guess what? Those things change. They will go find somebody else to take care of it. And then you'll get prison bollards in front of your school, right? Because they'll just ask the contractor to draft it up in Adobe Acrobat real quick so that they can throw those things in during construction. And that's what you get. And that, to me, is kind of crazy making. I just hope that having this conversation out loud right here and putting it out there for people to engage with is helpful and useful, and that it goes a little more in depth than, this is merely a time to reflect. Because just a few minutes to reflect isn't going to change anything. Thank you to BQE, the makers of BQE Core, for their support of this podcast episode. Visit bqe.com/masterclass to register for the next Designing Your Business Masterclass. Thanks for listening. This show is part of the Gable Media Podcast Network. See all the shows at gablemedia.com. That's GABLMEDIA.com. You can help support what we're doing here by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out, and don't forget to share it with your friends. We'd love to hear from you, so leave a comment on the website at archispeakpodcast.com, where you can find our entire catalog of shows. Talk to you soon.